Good day, everyone. We are Group 1, and today we will be discussing the first half of Natural Language and Formal Terminology and Article number 1. For this, we will be going over the following outline, starting with an introduction, followed by the following key points: the accuracy of coding health records, universal terminological systems, and compositional terminologies, followed by a discussion on the first article on the International Classification of Diseases.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and or good evening. So today we're going to talk about the second subtopic of health data management, which is natural language and terminologies. So as we already know that terminological systems are made to universally unify data and communication in a certain field, and ours is healthcare. And in this chapter, we're going to talk about the limitations as humans, what and how we're stopping the completion or universal use of terminologies. One factor could be language, and we're going to talk about the rest later. We're also going to talk about the challenges we face in maintaining and evolving terminologies. And lastly, we're going to talk about the the, the process of terminology assignment from a computation point of view. So that'll be it for the introduction. Now let's move on to. So right now we'll be talking about the accuracy of coding health records and how it is variable and never perfect. So first let's discuss what is coding. Coding is a process of compressing data and summarizing it. So there are systematical biases in our healthcare coding, according to Romano and Mark from the year 1994. And the key to this is actually the key to inaccuracy to an extent is standardizing and benchmarking coded data. But even with this, we only achieve 50 to like let's say 90%, 50 to 98% according to the book of accuracy, inaccuracy of health coding. So because there are always going to be errors. Coding errors can arise from for a number of reasons, such as uh, errors in patient record. A healthcare practitioner may have mislabeled or misplaced results and reports from one patient to another. That could happen. Another reason could be crucial data may not be available for the time of coding. And coders have to usually wait if there's a delay in the research team. It might take weeks or months, and it's delayed, and it causes a chain reaction of delayed uh, data. And coding may sometimes differ from a selection of primary reasons for an episode of care. So this is basically some data could be subjective. For example, data of why the patient came to the hospital, a patient who has multiple conditions, and what is the reason? Is the reason pneumonia? Is the reason lung cancer? Sometimes is not encoded in the system. Next is the coding and quality varies with the coder's expertise. Understanding the system and how it works, understanding disease and care processes is like learning a foreign language. And with this type of system that keeps evolving over time, it's very hard to keep up. And lastly, data entry errors. They're the distortion of data. A coder may intend to use correct code but inadvertently enter the wrong one because of mistakes made when coding the system. So that is it for this slide.
So now let's discuss about coding errors. So it can arise for a number of reasons. First, there may be errors in the patient records, perhaps introduced by the clinician writing the record or because the test results and reports from one patient end up in the record of another. Next, crucial data may not be available at the time of coding. Some laboratory tests, for example, may require weeks before a report is issued because the testing laboratory receives only a few requests and waits until it has accumulated a sufficient number to run the test in a single batch. Next, coding sometimes differs in the selection of primary reason for an episode of care. However, the notion of primary is likely to be subjective. Patients with multimorbidity have more than one trigger for needing care. So, is the hospital admission because the patient has lung cancer or because the patient has pneumonia associated with the cancer? Next is assignment of a code requires some understanding of the care process, and coding quality varies with the coder's expertise and with the coder's understanding of disease and the care process. Lastly, the data entry errors add their own distortion to the data. So a coder may intend to use the correct code but inadvertently enter the wrong one because of mistakes made when using a coding system.
The ideal terminological system would be a complete, formal, and universal language that allowed all healthcare concepts to be described, reasoned with, and communicated. Such was the goal for some researchers in the past. This task includes two requirements: the ability for the terminological language to cover all the concepts that needed to be reasoned about, and the independence of the terminology from any particular reasoning task. So, two fundamental obstacles to devising such a universal terminology, which is the model construction problem and symbol grounding problem. So, not everyone will match a label to exactly the same phenomena. Hence, if there is no guarantee of a universal definition of a concept, we resort to consensus processes in which most people agree on a label and its real world match.
So next we have two concepts are probabilistic, but terminologies are not. So words should clearly respond to observable objects. However, cognitive studies of the way people form word categories have shifted us from the view that categories exist objectively. Research suggests that all concepts are relative and are structured around probabilistic prototypes. These concept prototypes at the basic level are the product of pooling many examples observed from the world. They capture aspects common to all the examples and exclude aspects that are not universally shared. Thus, the qualities of prototypical categories that are generally true only of the examples they classify. To sum it up, concept creation is a learning process of generalization from example. The creation of concept prototypes is an ongoing part of human activity because language development tracks changes in our view of the world.
One consequence of the overlap in concept and terms is that when we come to label an object or event, there is no absolutely way correct to do it. Context dependence has several implications. First, automatically extracting coded terms from a patient record can be difficult if context has a significant bearing on which of a number of alternate labels should be selected. This requires the ability to understand the wider context surrounding a term. Is ventricle in the heart or the brain? In the sentence I spoke to him, the meaning of the word him depends on information that exists outside the sentence. If a set of terms is used in a variety of different contexts, then the same term may have a different meaning across these contexts. Pooling coded data could risk grouping together quite different things.
Two words are purposive. Philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein believed that language is not produced randomly, since he considered that concepts and language could not be created independently of their intended use. He rejected the idea of pure philosophical propositions. Philosophical and mathematical disciplines, according to Wittgenstein, are not repositories of unchanging reality, but rather information about how things are done. Thus, their opinions are still vulnerable to interpretation. Wittgenstein created language games that were used to build a language, with a clearly defined goal in order to demonstrate the relationship between language and its application. Healthcare categorization and definition of clinical ideas are not as straightforward as it looks at first glance. Even obvious exact ideas have limits that are established through use and may vary depending on the situation, such as the definition of a bone fracture. For instance, whether or not a fracture has clinical repercussions may influence the extent to which one goes in order to find it. Healthcare develops definitions of illness concepts with a particular goal in mind to remedy this lack of clarity. The majority of people who have the illness will be covered by these criteria, which are often built using observations or measurements. As a result, words and definitions are not entirely objective and depend on their context and intended use.
Like any language, the vocabulary used in the healthcare industry has evolved through time. Disease theories are only helpful when they fulfill a certain function, and newer theories replace the old ones. The healthcare industry is continually changing, with new ideas being introduced and the internal organization of clinical information being changed. Some illnesses that were formerly widespread have become extinct and are no longer recognized by healthcare professionals. Since its establishment in the 20th century, the ICD, or known as International Classification of Diseases, has expanded tremendously and currently includes more than 16,000 categories. Any clinical model will ultimately turn out to be erroneous and require some adjustment, since clinical knowledge is always evolving.
Terminological systems are useful for managing healthcare language, but they need continuous modification to reflect new areas and developments. Terminologies have a release cycle that involves gradual modification followed by a major revision of both structure and content, which can introduce errors and increase maintenance costs. Terminologies can be pre-coordinated or post-coordinated in design, with compositional systems requiring more structured and considered development, but ultimately being easier to maintain and expand. Compositional systems have lower error checking costs and can use reference ontologies for automated error checking. The investment in building a compositional system is initially higher, but it pays off over time compared to an enumerative system. In summary, terminological systems provide a practical basis for managing the language of healthcare, but they need to be modified continually as they expand into new areas. The release cycle for most terminologies consists of two phases: a period of gradual modification and a major revision that looks at both structure and content. Compositional terminologies require a more structured and considered approach to development initially, but they pay off over time as they require less effort to maintain and enlarge with lower costs for error checking.
So let us proceed with 24.3, which is mapping among terminologies is easier if they are created from the same compositional core. Direct mapping between different terminological systems is not always possible, as there are often differences and inconsistencies. The ICD works as a common reference terminology because it works at a general level of description, which allows for a translation from specific to general terms. This translation may result in the loss of some detail and meaning from the original term. Compositional systems have an advantage in sharing knowledge between different terminological systems because the method of generation is known and the mapping process is clearly defined. And lastly, if terms are created for different purposes within the same compositional system, it should be possible to create a mapping between them. In summary, there are significant challenges when attempting to map between different terminological systems, and it is unlikely that there will be a direct mapping. The ICD works as a common reference terminology due to its relatively general level of description, but this can result in the loss of detail and meaning from the original term. Compositional systems have an advantage and that the mapping process from one composition to another is clearly defined, making it possible to create a mapping between terms created for different purposes within the same compositional system.
So, for Article 1, the new International Classification of Diseases, 11th edition, a comparative analysis with ICD 10 and ICD 10 CM.
For the objective, to study the newly adopted International Classification of Diseases 11th revision and compare it to the International Classification of Diseases 10th revision and International Classification of Diseases 10th revision clinical modification. For the introduction, the WHO started working on ICD 11 in 2007 with involvement of experts from over 90 countries. ICD 11 was adopted in May 2019 by the World Health Assembly to be effective for use from January 2022. With every ICD version, code syntax usually changes, presumably to avoid confusion with older versions. Apart from these usual changes, ICD 11 gains three brand new features. Number one, Foundation Component is a multidimensional collection of medical entities like diseases, disorders, and injuries. The entities are defined with attributes such as body site, body system, and causal mechanism. These entities are organized into hierarchies and multi parenting is allowed. Number two, Post coordination. ICD 11 allows the combination of codes to add additional detail to an existing code. Two kinds of post coordination are allowed. One is two or more stem codes and stem codes with one or more extension codes. And lastly, digital friendly. Fully embracing the digital age, ICD 11 is accompanied by a host of online and digital resources. Online resources include browsers of the foundation component and various linearizations and a coding tool for the mortality and morbidity statistics linearization.
Materials and methods. Simple tabulation. ICD 11 codes, titles, and indexing terms in MMS. MMS linearization tabulation. Similar to simple tabulation with additional info and depth in tree. One category ICD 10 to ICD 11 map. Each ICD 10 code can map to only one ICD 11 code. Multiple categories ICD 10 to ICD 11 map. Each ICD 10 code can map to multiple ICD 11 codes. One category ICD 11 to ICD 10 map. Each ICD 11 code maps to only one ICD 10 code. ICD 10 comparison. The study focused on the first 25 chapters of the ICD 11 MMS linearization and used the one category ICD 10 to ICD 11 map to identify chapter drift. The chapter drift index was used to quantify the percentage of codes coming from ICD 10 chapters other than the main corresponding chapter. The study also identified equivalent codes between ICD 10 and ICD 11 using the round tripping method, where if an ICD 10 code mapped to a single ICD 11 code in the forward map and mapped back to the same ICD 10 code in the backward map, the codes were considered equivalent. Some round trip maps were manually reviewed. We also have here the ICD comparison results.
ICD 10 CM comparison. Since no maps existed, we used two approaches to compare ICD 11 to ICD 10 CM: lexical matching and manual recording. For lexical matching, we used the lexical tool LuiNorm from the Unified Medical Language System to normalize ICD 11 code names from chapters 1 to 25.29 to 30. We matched the normalized names to UMLS concepts using the Normalized English Strings Index. Through the UMLS concepts, we matched to ICD 10 CM codes, and we ignored ICD 11 index terms and ICD 10 CM inclusion terms because they could be narrower in meaning. For ICD 10 CM comparison result, lexical matching. By normalized lexical matching through the UMLS, we managed to find 4,559 pairs of matching ICD 11 and ICD 10 CM codes, covering 3,294 unique ICD 11 codes, and 3,985 unique ICD 10 CM codes. The breakdown of these code pairs are the following: 52 pairs of non leaf codes in both ICD 10 CM and ICD 11, 1,596 pairs of ICD 11 leaf codes matched to ICD 10 CM non leaf codes, 66 pairs of ICD 11 non leaf codes matched to ICD 10 CM leaf codes, and 2,345 pairs of leaf codes in both ICD 10 CM and ICD 11. For manual recording, we selected 388 ICD 10 CM leaf codes from 6 disease areas: tuberculosis, skin cancer, diabetes mellitus, type 2, hypertension, polyhydramnios, and fracture of thumb, and recorded them in ICD 11, using post coordination when necessary. Next, we have the discussion. Benefits of the new features. Number one, knowledge based approach to terminology management. The foundation component provides a knowledge base to facilitate the creation, maintenance, and quality assurance of ICD 11, allowing for multiple linearizations and structural alignment with logically defined terminologies. Number two, grace, graceful evolution. The foundation component paves the way for more open, transparent, and traceable change management processes. It can help achieve concept permanence and alleviate the problems caused by chapter drifts in ICD 11. Multi-parenting in the foundation component can maintain the link of a moved code to its original hierarchy, and the MMS browser can show codes in multiple tree positions. And lastly, number three, increase expressivity. The number of pre-coordinated leaf codes in ICD 11 is 38% higher than in ICD 10, but this does not fully reflect the increase in coverage or expressivity. Post coordination can reduce the number of pre coordinated codes in some chapters without affecting the ability to encode certain conditions. However, post coordination can lead to increased coding variability and no computational way to identify equivalence of coding.
Limitations and future work. The results of normalized lexical mapping between ICD-11 and ICD-10-CM have not been manually reviewed. The choice of the 6 disease areas for the recoding study was based on the clinical and terminological knowledge of the authors, and the results may not be generalizable to other disease areas. The recoding exercise was done by a single clinician terminologist and not independently validated. Moreover, they did not consider the usage frequencies of the codes, and it is possible that some unmappable codes were more heavily used than the mappable ones. More comprehensive study that focuses on the comparison with ICD-10-CM involving frequently used codes from all chapters and addressing concerns that include inter-rater agreement in coding, post-coordination variability, and compatibility of coding guidelines between ICD-11 and ICD-10-CM will be done in the future studies. For the conclusion, ICD-11 has 38% more pre-coordinated leaf codes compared to ICD-10, although many more code combinations can be produced if post-coordination was done. In the exercise of recoding ICD-10 CM codes in ICD-11, we found that 60% of ICD-10 CM codes could be fully represented with pre-coordinated codes or post-coordination, with the potential of even higher coverage by the addition of a small number of extension codes. And that's it for our group. Thank you all for listening.